This video will serve as video number 2 in our political geography lecture. Today we're actually going to talk about boundary conflicts a bit. We've already talked about how boundaries are created, so definitional and then delimited, and then oftentimes countries will decide to demarcate their boundaries. We also talked about the origins of certain boundaries. So we talked about antecedent boundaries, those that exist before populations show up. Subsequent boundaries, those that are actually drawn once a population has already developed a cultural landscape. We additionally talked about superimposed boundaries, which are actually imposed upon or drawn into areas where there's already groups of people living. And oftentimes, again, keep in mind, superimposed is from some form of authority or someone of power, typically not regarding the differences that actually exist between populations that are being divided. And then the last one was relic boundaries. And relic boundaries are, again, the idea that it is no longer a functioning boundary, and it might be ancient or something that was previously used in years before. We also need to talk about boundary conflicts. There are many different types of boundary conflicts that exist. A definitional boundary conflict is one where there is conflict between states over just the legal wording of a boundary agreement. A good example of this actually exists between Chile and Argentina. The legal boundary was worded so that there would be a line connecting the highest points in the Andes Mountains. This line would then be the boundary between Chile and Argentina. This was fine until there was actually oil found near the border, and at that point they actually sue each other to redefine the line, neither one really wanting to redefine the line because both really wanting sort of that resource. So this is just a conflict over the actual wording, or in this case, the definitional boundary. Another boundary conflict that exists is something called a locational boundary conflict. A locational boundary conflict is where the interpretation of the definition is problematic. A really good example of this is between Israel and Palestine. This is the idea of 1947 and the partition plan, and then 1948, the creation of Israel, and how the legal wording of that creation of Israel was interpreted by Israelis in one way, so that it would give them more land, and then Palestinians in another way so that they would actually receive more land. The question in the definition is not really the issue. The issue is how are these going to operate, and locationally, how are people going to interpret where those boundaries actually lie. Another example is an operational boundary conflict. An operational boundary conflict is also sometimes called a functional boundary conflict, and that's because there is a disagreement between states about how a boundary should actually operate. An example of this might be the US and Mexico. If you ask Mexico how the border between the United States and Mexico should operate, they may say that there needs to be, that they aren't really concerned about issues of migration or smuggling or anything of that nature, and that it should just be an open border. Mexico might have that take, but the United States, their take may be a little bit more along the lines of wanting to create a boundary that functions as a barrier, more so than just some sort of like delineation across the landscape. And therefore that results in things where we've actually had a lot of political discourse about this, about how this border should actually function. And it's resulting in a demarcation of the boundary on the side of the United States. The last one is allocational boundary conflicts. An allocational boundary conflict is a dispute over the right to resources in an area. When you think of this one, think about the allocation of resources. The allocation of resources is the distribution of resources. So therefore, in many cases, we're talking about oil or other non-renewable resources. A good example of this is in the Spratly Islands or the South China Sea, which we'll talk in a moment about. And another good example is between Iraq and Kuwait. During the Persian Gulf War, Iraq actually suggested that Kuwait crossed over into the Iraqi territory in order to drill oil. Kuwait, of course, denies this, and ultimately Iraq invades Kuwait in the Persian Gulf War. So that conflict was all because of a right to and a dispute over the right to resources in areas. When we talk about types of boundaries, I'm going to just briefly mention this because it's in your book, but remember that there are two different major types of boundaries, physical and cultural. The physical boundaries are going to be mountains, deserts, and water. And again, these boundaries are ones that coincide with the natural landscape. So we're still drawing something on a map and we're defining it, but we're using physical features to do so. Another example is the conflict with the physical boundaries that exist. So when we talk about water as a boundary, that often means seas, it means rivers, it means lakes, but it also means seas and oceans. This actually brings about a little bit of a conflict. Keep in mind, in the 1800s, the ocean territorial limits away from your state, your territory extended 3 nautical miles off the coast. And that's because really technology and shipping was not a major issue. Fishing, nobody really went further than 3 nautical miles because the ships were not the industrial sort of ships that today we can actually, fish for days before we actually come back to shore because of refrigeration and all sorts of other high-tech things. So by 1983, the world kind of agrees that they need to set some sort of new standardized territorial limit. This is actually called the Law of the Sea. It was developed by the United Nations, and it standardized territorial limits to 12 nautical miles. So your country has 12 nautical miles away from the baseline, basically away from the shore, to claim as their own. They also get to claim 200 nautical miles off the coast as their EEZ. An EEZ is an exclusive economic zone, and that is where they actually have the right to, and we actually say the word, they have the right to exploit that area for resources. So that could mean drilling for oil or fishing or marine life, any of that type of stuff extends 200 nautical miles off the coast. The idea being, if countries have less than 400 nautical miles between the two of them, then they must actually negotiate that separation. This becomes an issue if countries are unwilling to negotiate, and particularly if resources lie within that territory between the two. An example of this is actually the Spratly Islands. The Spratly Islands, you'll hear them called the Spratly Islands. You'll also hear it called the South China Sea. The South China Sea sits between China and really the Philippines, Brunei, Malaysia, a little bit of like Singapore, and then Vietnam, and then Taiwan. So this area is a sea that's actually a major shipping route, but the issue really becomes more apparent when researchers believe that there are oil reserves and natural gas reserves out in the middle of this area. There's a set of island chains. There's some of them Paracel Islands, also the Spratly Islands. And as we look at the law of the sea, again, your sort of right to drill for oil extends 200 nautical miles away from those islands. So now the question becomes, whose islands are those? And whose sort of territorial limits are those? And then whose EEZs are those? Well, the Philippines and Vietnam, all of those, if you actually look at the drawing here, they would argue that their exclusive economic zones go all the way out to sort of that light blue dotted line. China, though, claims that all of that land is actually theirs, and all of that territory, or EEZs, all of that is theirs because of their ownership over those islands. They actually would say that historically those were their islands for hundreds of thousands of years, and that's what their maps show. At the same time, though, all of the other countries in that area would argue that their maps don't show that and that they've never been under Chinese control. So there's a great deal of conflict over who has the right to the resources in this area. The United States is actually kind of playing an interesting role. We're trying to sort of facilitate and kind of keep China from just dominating and taking over that area, because militarily, in terms of their warships, they could easily go in and take out like the Vietnamese or the Filipino like militaries. We also are in an agreement with the Philippines since World War II to defend them in the case of attack, and so therefore we find ourselves kind of in the middle of this. It may also be interesting to consider whether or not we're also kind of in the middle of this because of the prospect of maybe our allies getting oil and then being able to sell that to us. One interesting development that's come along with this is actually China building man-made islands. They are building these man-made islands and creating ports and basically military bases out in the middle of the South China Sea, and then again claiming 200 nautical miles away from those. So this could become a really big hotspot, and it all really boils down to whose islands are they? And are they going to recognize each other's EEZs, or are they going to start actually drilling in those areas? And if so, will that cause a potential war? When we talk about types of boundaries, the other one that I mentioned, the other category is cultural. Geometric lines, those are just the idea that humans like to construct straight lines typically, and therefore we arbitrarily place things like latitude and longitude across space. The United States actually has a geometric boundary between the United States and Canada, which is the 49th parallel, and also a geometric boundary between Mexico and the United States. And again, that's just a straight line. Religious boundaries, good examples would be Ireland, Northern Ireland, or India and the Pakistan partition. Language has also been used. It's actually one that was used most for dividing up and trying to create nation states in the Europe region. And then ethnicity has also been used. Ethnicity, the best example here, of course, is Cyprus, with the Greeks and the Turks actually dividing it, so much so that they divide the capital, and there are peacekeeping forces still there. When we talk about boundaries, okay, keep in mind that a boundary is very different from a frontier. They like to ask about this a lot. A boundary, of course, is infinitely thin. It's invisible. It's an imaginary line. And they almost have exclusively and nearly universally replaced frontiers, because today, if there was any frontier out there, it's basically been gobbled up, and technology allows for pretty good monitoring of borders. The only true frontier that really exists anymore would be Antarctica, as it is not under anyone's sovereign area. And then there's some disputed frontier in the Arabian Peninsula around Saudi Arabia, Yemen, and Oman. When we talk about boundaries inside states, keep in mind that some states are unitary and some are federal. Unitary, your prefix there, uni, means one, and so that is a country that has one strong central government. A good example of this would be China, or a communist government. Another good example would be France, and then any of the blue ones in this diagram. Federal states are ones that actually allocate some power to states. So, for example, our federal system allows for 50 states, and they have some degree of autonomy underneath the central government. The larger the amount of land you have, the better and more practical it is for you to have a federal government, and that way local areas can kind of take care of the concerns of a local needs. A good example, though, would be like China, for example, is a really large country, and they make everybody sort of abide by the central government standards. So, for example, all one time zone, which may not necessarily benefit farmers in far regions of the world, far regions of China, where the sun may set incredibly early based on the time, or incredibly late based on the time. Why would multinational states use unitary? Keep in mind, a multinational state is different from a multi-ethnic state. A multi-ethnic state is just a state that has multiple ethnicities living in it. A multinational state is one that actually has ethnicities living in it that had traditions of self-rule, which means they used to have and regard themselves as their own state. A lot of states that are multinational are a little bit nervous about this, because that means that there's a greater chance for devolution of those ethnic groups, or even balkanization. So if you have a unitary system, you actually have a little bit more control over those like areas and those ethnic groups, rather than giving them the federal system sort of representation. And again, the threat there for that country central government is that if you give them too much power, eventually they may just balkanize. When we talk about boundaries within states, we also need to talk about gerrymandering. Gerrymandering is when you are actually redrawing voting districts to benefit one political party or another. Keep in mind that this happens in the United States, and that's because state governments, typically the House of Representatives has a committee for the state government that will actually redraw the districts after census results come back, and so that reallocation of seats in the federal House of Representatives, U.S. House of Representatives, is decided based upon the voting districts that are drawn at the state level. Gerrymandering results in something called wasted vote, and excess vote. Wasted vote we call cracking, and that is when you spread apart your competition. So if an area was a majority Democrat and you don't want them to actually win the Democratic influence, then you would actually divide up all of the Democrats into other regions where Republicans are the majority. Excess vote is the opposite. Excess vote would be giving the Democrats that area and lumping them all together, but then ultimately your state actually having more Republican districts rather than Democrat districts. And I'll actually give you, in class, we're going to go over some examples of this. And if you have questions about it, if for some reason you missed class and you have questions about the difference between wasted and excess and stacking, please come and see me. This is something that is seen as unconstitutional. However, it really hasn't stopped places from this happening. North Carolina is probably the best example of a gerrymandered state. And unfortunately, this means that there's very few competitive seats in Congress today.